Before I start this review, I think it's only prudent for me to say that I consider myself an older BioWare fan. I was a big fan of Dragon Age Origins when it came out, and before then I was already a big Mass Effect fan. Dragon Age 2 I sort of tolerated, and then I went back to liking Dragon Age again after Inquisition, albeit with some pet peeves about that game in particular. So suffice it to say, I've been looking forward to the launch of Dragon Age the Veilguard with bated breath, but I've also been pretty worried because I know what it means for the future if this game doesn't do well in terms of sales. That said, as I obviously would want BioWare to survive for the foreseeable future, I should by all logic try to sell you on Veilguard. Should I not? Well, as much as I want this game to succeed, I cannot and I will not pretend that Veilguard is a perfect game, because it certainly isn't. Now, in regular fashion, I will be categorizing different sections about the game with timestamps, so feel free to click through to the section that you're most interested in. First of all, let's talk about the character creator. I'll be frank, the character creator is not as good as some outlets made it out to be before launch, and it's absolutely not on the level of Dragon's Dogma 2. I'm particularly disappointed in the body customization, as you can adjust the height and the overall shape of your body, but the base aesthetics are always the same. There's also a face mesh function where you combine 3 different heads and mold them into something appealing, and well, it's admittedly pretty good, and I actually managed to make a pretty cute female rook on my second playthrough. Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion surrounding hairstyles, and yes, while there are a lot of them, I gotta say that I don't think most of them are that good, especially since there's a distinct lack of short hairstyles, and this was especially noticeable as I tried to recreate myself on my first rook. And unfortunately, I wasn't very happy with them. Essentially, there are only 2 short hairstyles that look sort of alright, and I'm pretty disappointed in both the selection of hairstyles and just the aesthetics of most of them. Then again, that's more of a personal gripe, maybe you love them, and that's okay. Presentation-wise, I think Veilguard looks pretty good, and that's admittedly because I've been running it on maxed out settings with full ray tracing on a high-end PC build. That said, the game does have a distinct visual flair, and I think environments especially look really good. There are some cases where it's less than perfect though, but overall, details, shadows, lighting, colors, and visual effects, all of it looks really nice and smooth, and the game does look better when you're actually playing it compared to watching gameplay of it. Thankfully, this is by far the most polished BioWare title to date, I feel. I can't speak for everyone, obviously, but I haven't encountered any crashes, stutters, or any performance issues whatsoever, and the only bug that I encountered was when I fell into the water and got stuck in a loop of drowning over and over.
Hello, how are you? I am under the water. Please help me. Now
yes, the art style is odd. Heads are a little bit too big, body proportions are kinda wonky for a lot of the characters, but thankfully I got used to it. That is to say, I don't love the art style at all, and I wish they'd have gone with a more photorealistic look. This also brings us to animations, and let's just say that this has been a big talking point in recent years, especially after the Andromeda debacle. And well, I think most of the time, Veilguard has some pretty, well, okay facial animations, especially in dialogue scenes with your companions. Now, this is not always true for every cutscene or dialogue scene, as there are definitely some moments of tired face syndrome on display, as you may or may not have noticed from other reviewers. But in general terms, I think that they've done an okay job on animations and facial movements, at least if you compare it to Andromeda. But I hesitate to say that it's really better than previous titles. However, I think this comes down to more of a dialogue issue. And so let's talk about the dialogue for a bit, and well, this is very much a mixed bag for me. See, BioWare during their heyday built up a reputation for creating some of the richest dialogue in gaming, and Dragon Age Origins and the Mass Effect trilogy especially showed just how nuanced characters could be and feel as you picked through an assortment of dialogue and conversations with your companions. These games always delivered some very memorable lines. One line in particular that I'll never forget is this one.
Stand in the ashes of 1,000,000,000 dead souls and ask the ghosts if honor matters. This silence is your answer.
And hell, even Inquisition had a really good line from Corypheus.
Beg that I succeed, for I have seen the throne of the gods, and it was empty.
Unfortunately, Veilguard doesn't really have any dialogue that's as hard-hitting as some of these. That said, I don't think that most of Veilguard's dialogue is necessarily bad, it just doesn't really stand out. In other words, it's mostly very generic, and at times just really painful to listen to.
Your hair's so bright in the sunlight. Sorry, it's just really pretty.
Brother,
The game also has a tendency to over-explain things, and there's a lot of exposition dialogue, which can get pretty tiring to listen to. Especially so when characters keep repeating stuff that you already know as if you're an amnesiac, like the fact that the gods have escaped their prisons, which is a line that is oft repeated throughout the game.
Solus got pulled into the Fade, and two somethings got pulled out. Or someones, I mean. Two of the evil elven gods. Elganon and Gillenane.
Mathalanast.
The elven gods of old. The Evan Eurus.
The dialogue and your choices definitely feel way too safe throughout most of the game, and you can't really roleplay as a true tough guy, which honestly kinda sucks. The over-reliance on getting to know your companions mostly only through companion quests doesn't do the game any favors either, especially so since there are a lot of companion quests in Veilguard. That is to say, each companion has several quests that you have to complete in order to prepare them for the final act of the game. Now don't get me wrong, I love loyalty missions and companion quests, but I do feel that there is a tad bit too much of it in this game, and at one point it felt like instead of grinding XP in the hinterlands, I was now grinding away uninteresting filler quests that just didn't add anything to my experience, all just to make sure that my companions were as strong as possible before the final chapter. That said, I do think Harding and Lucanus have some pretty good storylines, and Davrans is surprisingly interesting as well. But other than this, I can't say that much of it is insanely memorable or anything, which is pretty sad as a long-time dialogue head. The voice acting is pretty alright, thankfully, and I think the voice actors do the best they can with the material they're provided. My biggest problem with all of this, however, is the tone. Aside from the main story events, the game just has this brighter tone of sorts than previous games. Yes, horrible things happen every now and then, but I think the overabundance of quippy dialogue, the lack of any meaningful companion rivalry, and the fact that you can't really be edgy just makes the game feel tonally off balance a lot of the time. Now, Veilguard has been likened to that of Pixar movies many times already, and while I don't think that this applies to everything in the game, some scenes could absolutely be ripped out of one, such as that of the introduction of Belara or Emric, both of which have some pretty oddly cute music for some reasons during some of their scenes.
Ugh, you come in. Oh no! Sorry. Just breaking things.
I do want to give a shout out to three characters that do stand out, however, those being Solus, Gillenane, and Elgarnon, the three gods that you'll be dealing with throughout the game. These three are absolutely the most interesting parts of Veilguard, and I like the mythology built up surrounding the Elven gods in general. That said, the two main villains are pretty generic, albeit I do enjoy that they're deliciously evil just for the sake of it, and I think it kinda works for this game. I just wish that the rest of the game had the same tone throughout. Gareth David Lloyd does a tremendous job as Solus, and I think he carries most of the scenes he's in. And I really wish we just had more Solus in general, because I do think that there's a distinct lack of him, especially throughout the middle act of the game. That said, if there is to be anything really memorable in terms of dialogue, I'd say that most of it comes from him. Now, following up on dialogue, let's talk about the story. And well, I do enjoy the setup of the ancient elven gods returning after you mess up Solus' ritual. The structure of the story is pretty linear, and thankfully you don't have to run around aimlessly for hours just to get to the next point, which I appreciate a lot because at its core, this is a story-based game. Think of it like the story structure of Mass Effect 2, but whereas Mass Effect 2 struck a good balance of companion to main story missions, Veilguard, as I mentioned before, has a little bit too much filler, at least to me. And one thing that has been heavily discussed across the internet before launch has been about Veilguard's combat, so let's get to it. There are some things that I like about the combat, and there are some things that I dislike about it. First and foremost, as I'm playing on PC, I have to say that I don't like how the game feels on keyboard and mouse. It feels way too floaty, and there's definitely a disconnect from the chunky combat when you play it like this. So I recommend using a controller if you're going to play this on PC. For example, when I switched to my PS5 controller, the combat felt properly heavy and chunky, and I think BioWare definitely made this game with a controller in mind. Now yes, the combat is very, very similar to the new God of War games, especially if you play as a warrior. Now, I don't necessarily have a problem with this as I loved those games, but as an average companion swapping fan, I do miss the function of being able to control my companions directly, which you can't do in Veilguard. Yes, I know that I'm in the minority, still I think the companion swapping mechanic was a really cool element of the Dragon Age games, as it allowed you a breath of fresh air if you ever grew tired of using your particular class. Because as smooth as combat can be in Veilguard, it also has a tendency to get pretty repetitive and honestly pretty stale, and I can definitely see why a lot of people are probably gonna get burnt out after a while. As I've tried all the 3 classes, I'd say that the mage is probably the one that I found most enjoyment with. I mean, you can spawn black holes and planetary bodies, that's just an instant win for me. That said, the combo system is alright, I guess. I do wish that BioWare had added different detonation effects because as it stands, the detonation for pulling off combos is always the same, which again got pretty repetitive and less impressive as time went on.
Yourselves.
There's a lot of build variety for each class, which I appreciate. It definitely helped making things feel fresh, but I'd have loved it if you could save your builds because it gets pretty tiring having to select every talent over and over again for specific encounters. For example, fire is pretty effective for Darkspawn, and so whenever I was about to go on a Darkspawn-centric mission, I swapped over to fire-specific abilities. But then I'd have to swap back again to another element when facing other enemy types, which just takes time I'd rather use for other things. I also feel there's a distinct lack of variety to the combat finishers. Yes, it's cool to impale enemies with your dagger as you hold them up with magic the first few times, but ironically, this particular magic wears off pretty quickly too, no matter how cool it looks at first. There are a couple of other finisher animations, but these are very few and far between as they're specific to certain enemy types, like for the ogres for example, which you won't be fighting as much as all the other enemies. On the flip side, moment-to-moment gameplay aside from combat is pretty enjoyable. I'm a proper loot goblin, and so I enjoyed running around the explorable zones looking for treasure and various other items, such as the wolf statues that give you additional skill points. Yes, the puzzles are literally designed for babies, and I wish they were more challenging. However, I still found them somewhat enjoyable, if only to feed that completionist engine inside of me. So Dragon Age the Veilguard has me feeling really conflicted. On one hand, I can appreciate that BioWare dared to finally make this essentially a fully realized action game. It plays really well for the most part, and the combat is really enjoyable, the story is streamlined, and the narrative is pretty tight if you just do the main missions. The Elven gods and our beloved egghead Solus has some interesting lore, and some of the revelations about the nature of Thedas itself is admittedly pretty cool, albeit somewhat unsurprising. However, I can't say that there's much that I actually love about Veilguard, which kinda breaks my heart, because trust me, I really want to love this game, but I just can't. The exposition heavy-handed, and at times really ham-fisted dialogue, the repetitive combat and enemy encounters, the overabundance of companion quests, the overhyped character creation system, well, all of this really started to take its toll on me, and by the point I had reached the end of Act 2, I felt like I was mostly just completing a checklist of things so I could get to the end of the game, which, mind you, was actually pretty good. Frankly, Act 3 is by far the best part of Veilguard, and I'm glad that BioWare managed to deliver on the final act of the game. For reference, it kinda reminded me of a mix of Mass Effect 2 and 3, where the stakes are insanely high, and yes, people can die, which I really like, and I think Act 3 alone kinda makes up for most of the, let's say, forgettable stuff in Act 1 and 2. Now, I haven't really talked about choices, but yes, there are some choices that have some pretty big ramifications on your playthrough, one in particular at the end of Act 1 that might warrant another playthrough, and then there's a couple of choices towards the end of the game, but it's not like you make massive decisions all of the time, so I'd suggest keeping those expectations in check. Also, the lack of important choices makes me really sad, and I really wish BioWare hadn't skipped out on every choice but the Trespasser DLC for this one. They still reference some things that's happened previously in Dragon Age, and they even seem to canonize at least one choice, which I'm obviously not going to spoil here. But at the end of the day, Dragon Age the Veilguard is sort of a 2 steps forward, 2 steps back situation for me. While BioWare did some things that pushed the Dragon Age franchise in the right direction, such as expanding on the lore and providing mostly enjoyable gameplay, they also removed aspects of what made Dragon Age, well, Dragon Age, such as the excellent dialogue. And again, it's not like the dialogue is a complete disaster, but it just does not hold up to previous games. To boil it down, Veilguard is sort of Dragon Age Light Edition. It still has elements that made Dragon Age memorable as a franchise, but it also moves on from certain aspects, so much so that at times doesn't really feel like a Dragon Age game. To put it bluntly, Veilguard is a capable game, but I don't think it's really more than that, which is disappointing because as an old-timer BioWare fan, I really wanted this title to be amazing. So trust me when I say that it actually hurts when I say this, and considering that I'm pretty biased about these games, that should tell you quite a lot about how I feel. All that said, I still think it's enjoyable for what it is, but it definitely could have been so much more, especially since expectations have been so high. Do I think it's worth buying for 60 bucks? Well, it depends. If you're someone who's been a Dragon Age fan since either Origins and through Inquisition, then yeah, you'll probably enjoy Veilguard too. But if you're someone who fell in love with Origins then fell out of love with the sequels, then Veilguard will in all likelihood not turn you into a Dragon Age fan. If you're completely new to the Dragon Age franchise, well, it also really depends. Are you a dialogue-driven person, or are you a gameplay-driven person? Now personally, I'm still interested in seeing where the franchise goes next because BioWare does add some sequel bait at the end of the game, which at least made me curious. But that's gonna have to do it for today. Thank you for watching this relatively short review. I'll be honest, I was planning on making a much longer video, but I wanted to stay away from spoiling too much, and because I just really don't have that much to say other than this, I decided to make this more of a summary. Thank you to all of my lovely members for supporting the channel, and remember to leave your thoughts in the comments below. Just remember to keep it respectful. This has been Mr. Holton, signing out.